Hello, hello.
Hello.
Hey, Sherry.
Hey.
Hey, Tom. Great job on the, oh wait, you're on mute. I don't know if you can unmute yourself.
People have been trying to mute me my whole life.
I'm gonna steal that joke, okay? Use it in my undoubtedly in the next hour when I have another Zoom meeting.
Oh no.
And Brandon's here too. Hey, Brandon. Hey, are you just attending, or are you here on behalf of the ELK team?
I am here on behalf of the ELK team. I am the moderator for this session.
Moderator, thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Anything we need to know or consider? Hey, Amanda.
Nope, I've made both you and Sherry co-hosts, so you should be able to share and all that kind of stuff. I'll be letting people in, and you know, we've had really good behavior throughout the conference, really good netiquette. So I haven't had to kick anybody out yet, but you know, we might have that problem here. We'll see.
Keeping out the riffraff, huh? And good attendance too, Brandon?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've seen sessions. We've been hovering around the you know, probably around the 50 range for each of the concurrent sessions, but I've had a couple go real close to 100. I think yesterday I had one that was above 125, which is crazy considering the last couple of years that that I've been at ELK. We've been looking at, you know, 10, 12, 20 folks, and we're doubling that as a minimum. So
that's great. Very exciting times.
I work at a urban planning nonprofit. We do a lot of like events and stuff. And in moving to the virtual, we had like a few hundred people at some where like normally we'd have like 20 people in a room. Like it's reaching like a much broader audience.
I mean, I think it's kind of cool. It's an interesting step, but I think we've been forced in this direction, and hopefully that means that the good ideas and research that people are generating are gonna kind of have a wider impact than was previously possible.
A quick question for our panel here. Did we decide, are we showing the video?
Well, I think you should.
Yeah, I just didn't know.
How long is it again?
It's about, is it 9 minutes maybe?
Was it 9? Really?
Could you show part of it to get an idea if you want to show it without showing the full thing?
It's kind of like, let's see, 11 minutes. It's 11 minutes long. I just, you know, like I said, it's a short film with kind of there's no dialogue. I don't know. And I don't want to ruin the ending. I don't know, but you kind of need to see the ending, I guess, to feel the full effect. Tom, what do you all think
I think the danger is losing people's interests for that long of a time. Is there a way we could start halfway through or 2/3 through so they see whatever that ending is, but they get the idea of
yeah, you know what? Let's see, how much time do we have? We have 4 minutes. Let me see if I can mark up a good point on the video. Give me 1 sec.
REMCAD representing James Sherman, Jim Ryman, Becky Black.
Oh yeah, I forgot. It's a dark video. I did watch it the other day. Maybe, yeah. I don't know.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, James. Amanda, this is my colleague, James Sherman. And
hello, Amanda.
And then the 2 profiles below that too.
All right, I'm back. I could suggest maybe the first 4 minutes. Is that too long still?
That's workable, I think.
That's workable?
Yeah.
Okay. And we'll just recommend folks to finish it on their own.
So
And you can always, if you feel like it's going too long or something, you can always, you know, jump back.
If my emotional, you know, intelligence is that advanced that I can get a feel for the room just by being in Zoom, I'm certainly going to do that.
So Spencer, we'll wait for you to prompt us, okay, to call us up. And also, I might ask you to click on a couple of links so we can see like images and stuff that we didn't embed in the slide, okay? But it won't take long.
That sounds good.
Okay.
Oh, now you're seeing my desktop. Pardon me. 1 second. Let's get back to our presentation. And I'm going to use UCT, Universal Cell Phone Time, to get us started, if that's okay. So I have a countdown of 2 minutes right now.
So my dog is barking in the a couple of rooms away. Can you guys hear that? No? Spencer, is Kyla on?
I haven't.
Oh.
Oh, hey, Kalia.
Oh yeah, I apologize.
There you are. I was going to say, I was trying to scroll through and see. We are now right at 3 o'clock. And Brandon, do we need to give you any cue before we get started? Looking for you.
Not at all. I can do a quick introduction if you'd like, but you guys you have the floor. It's your show.
Awesome. All right. Well, if our panelists are ready, I think we're ready to jump in. So thank you all for attending today's session. And the name of the session is Smart Cities, What Role Does Education Play? This was a topic that Sherry and I were discussing. My name is Spencer. I should start there. My name is Spencer and I am the facilitator for today, but this is a topic that one of our panelists and I were discussing earlier this year. And just being interested in data and some of the other kind of intersections of data and higher ed, smart cities, the public interest in public data, the private interest in private data. This is really a topic that we thought was an interesting topic to bring to this audience. So thank you all for joining us. I will be sharing my screen here. And thank you to our panelists as well. They'll be introducing themselves in just a moment, but we thought we'd start with a quick overview of kind of what we're aiming to discuss today. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat and kind of glean some of those questions, but we do have time for Q&A during the closing comments. So if you do have some compelling questions that you'd like to share with the rest of the audience, please jot those down or throw them in the chat and then feel free to speak up towards the end of the presentation. So again, just to cover what we'll be speaking with you all today, we have our welcome and our introductions. We're going to set some context around smart cities, so-called smart cities, I should say. And then we'll discuss a little bit more about the education, the role of education. And we have 3 expert panelists who all bring different perspectives on that topic. And then we'll jump into a Q&A portion. So let's start with introductions. Since I'm speaking, I'll just introduce myself. And my name is Spencer Ellis. I work at the Colorado Department of Higher Education. I'm the Director of Educational Innovation, and I work on a number of projects at the department, but my work has brought me to working with such fantastic individuals as Sherry Jones. And so that was kind of my way of making it to this project, and actually this very specific session, as I mentioned kind of in the opening. We've been talking about this topic, and I had a growing interest in this for a number of different reasons. We do administer and collect a lot of data and data reporting at the department and at the state of Colorado. And there are many ongoing conversations about data governance, shared data and public data, and how that is used and or not used by different entities. So when you start to talk about smart cities and how important data is to these so-called smart cities, that's kind of where my interest comes in. Sherry, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Spencer. So I'm Sherry Jones. I teach philosophy and game studies at Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. I also conduct research in smart cities, and I'm also coming from a designer perspective on how to design smart city to promote equity and diversity and access. That's where my interests lie.
Thank you, Sherry. And Tom, how about yourself?
Hi, my name is Tom Keefe. I also work at the college with Sherry Jones, the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. I'm a professor of humanities, and my research area, my interest is in dehumanization. And so when I look at a topic like smart cities, I'm concerned with the effect it has on people. And I'm also interested in the legal ramifications.
Thank you, Tom. And Amanda.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amanda Fasenmeyer. I'm the Director of Corporate Philanthropy at SPUR, which is an urban planning nonprofit in the Bay Area. I also have an MBA in Sustainable Management from Presidio Graduate School, so I come at kind of looking at smart cities from a sustainability angle as well.
Thank you. And Kalia?
Hi, my name's Kalia. My handle online is Identity Woman. I've been working in the field amongst technologists to support the emergence of a new layer of the internet for people. This intersects with smart cities as soon as we talk about sensors and devices and all sorts of things where we may be interacting in the built environment, not just when we're in front of screens. And I also am an instructor at Merritt College in Oakland, California.
Spencer, you're on mute.
Thank you. I think the diverse perspectives represented by this panel are really going to help enhance the conversation today. So thank you all. All right, so on to part 2, setting a little bit of context around smart cities. So Sherry, I think we're going to start with the video, or would you like to start with definitions?
Please go ahead and start with the video.
Okay, bear with me while I transition to video, folks. I'm just going to pull up everybody's favorite YouTube. And no, I do not have premium, so please don't give me a hard time. This is a short film called Frames. It was actually shared at another conference recently, and we were able to kind of learn a little bit more about the kind of, I would like to let the film kind of tell its own story. It's an 11-minute film, but we're only going to be showing about 4 minutes of the film to help you get a better feel for this artist's representation of so-called smart cities and kind of some of the aspects behind smart cities and how perhaps they function with kind of a nod to surveillance. So we'll show a portion of this film, but I would encourage you all, as we want to make sure to get through this presentation, I would encourage you all to finish this film if you get the chance. All right, so we're gonna dip back over to the presentation, but that's really just to queue up some of the conversations that we're going to have. And I'm going to turn it over now to Sherry. I know, Sherry, there's a lot to unpack from that video, but maybe you can help us start with kind of understanding what are smart cities and maybe unpacking a little bit of this video at the same time.
Thanks, Spencer. Well, that presents somewhat of a dark look at smart cities, which is a possibility. But let's define some of the terms first, okay? So smart cities is actually a marketing term, but particularly it's a vision of a tech-driven, right? Technology-driven city with sensors, AI devices, and data. So those are the 4 big things that's in a smart city. And it's been seen as a way to further marketing for the marketing folks. So an example of that would be Ride and Buy, or Buy and Ride. I'm trying to remember that company, where they're actually placing ads inside a self-driving car. So the idea is that you get to ride a free car, but you have to look at ads all day, right? And that's probably predicted by a lot of people. That's where it's going. So that's a smart city in tech-driven ways. Sustainable city, according to academics, where we define sustainable city, is a city that help with the environment, right? That consider the environment in its construction. So a couple of examples there. First is the artificial trees and machine to reduce CO2. So Spencer, if you don't mind clicking on artificial trees, so our attendees can kind of see what that is. It's just an example. This has been implemented in China. So the idea is I will suck CO2 out of the air and also beautify the environment. So this would be a tech-driven solution. In fact, scientists from all over the world is asking for construction of faux trees or artificial trees to be planted because our rate of planting real trees does not catch up as fast as we like. Okay, so that would be an example. So you can go back. Thank you. Pavagen, this company also created Kinetic Sidewalks to harvest energy. So if you can click on that link for me too. Kinetic Sidewalks, there we go. So they just received funding to do this, but if we scroll down slightly, without playing the video, that's what they're doing. Is they're creating these floorboards on the street, on the sidewalk, so when people walk over it, it creates energy, and they're harvesting energy this way to power a city. So that's been around for several years now. In fact, in China, Beijing, Shanghai, they already have this technology there. Okay, let's go back. Thank you. So another definition, as some people like to define this way, is data-driven smart urbanism. So there's some key characteristics, right? So, oops, if we can go back. Okay, so some of the key characteristics is datification of city systems and processes, reducing, here's the negative part, which is reducing urban life to algorithms and procedures. That's what urban life is now, as the video kind of hinted at. And then the good part is the holistic and integrated view of an intelligent city. So you can see the city and all its data at its whole. So I'm gonna give it to Kalia on the origin of smart city and identity management.
Sure, thanks, Sherry. So one of the things when we were planning for this, this panel that came up was actually that the higher education community had been ahead of almost all other sectors in supporting the emergence of identity management at scale. So identity management is sort of when you get an account with the system, and being the networks through which email spread first, faculty were given email accounts and were communicating using that decades before the general public was. And then those higher education institutions worked together to figure out how you could basically log into your university and be able to connect to and interact with other separate universities. And this is called federation. So higher education led the way in terms of creating large-scale federations for interaction across the networks of institutions. And there's actually it's really fun, a global institution now called ReFeds, which is where all the federations come to talk about how they federate their federations globally. So this raises a question, sort of like, if we move towards more ubiquitous connections and interactions in the future smart cities, where do we anchor the digital representations of those people moving around? And how is it done in a way that's really empowering and centers people and doesn't just mean that everybody has to go get an account with someone else? Like, I don't want to be in a smart city where everything I do is linked to my Gmail account or to my Microsoft account, and have it. And anyway, so I don't want to go into the details. Some of the work I've been doing for many years is sort of asking that question about how to create nodes or anchors in digital space that people own and control in ways that get them out of any particular route in an institution or a corporation. And I'll turn it back to you, Sherry, for improvising this virtual thing. Yeah.
Thank you, Kalia. And Sherry, I think we're on to the next slide, right? So Sherry, would you like to kind of continue on with some of the definitions of some of these other terminology just to continue setting the context?
Right, and I'll do this quickly. So technocracy is a term that's been around for a long time. I mean, we can trace it all the way back to Socrates with the philosopher king concept, which is the idea that experts rule government, run cities, right? So the quickest way to understand technocracy is experts-based governance, okay? And also most technocrats, if they define themselves as technocrats, believe that technology provides a solution to everything. That's what a technocrat, self-described technocrat believe. But some of the issues with technocracy-based governance, right, is that everything, if they're going to be the one creating a smart city, which I very much will be, is top-down design, right, from experts down, right? Elitism, because whoever has the power, right, has the ability to design the city they want. Corporate interest will be a factor. For profit will obviously put on the forefront. And another fear is that it will further entrench power relations, right? So those who are in power will stay in power because they're the one designing the city. So another term that we need to understand is a pan city. So pan city is the idea that now that we have collected all this data from multiple facilities and devices in a smart city, right? Whether it's from sensors or devices, that a pan city will efficiently make all those devices and sensors speak to each other as if they're modules. So individual modules that speak to each other, so connected better so that government can use that data or businesses can use that data. So some of the example is, for example, India currently is trying to develop 100 smart cities. And Spencer, if you don't mind clicking on the word India there. So, yeah, I just want to show people the reality. So it's not just me saying 100 cities, but they literally have a listing, how much it costs and how long it's going to take for all these 100 cities. Right now, I think they list like 99 on this site. But that's where things are going. But the way India envisioned even a bigger version of a pan city. So it's not just individual devices as modules that plug into each other, but each city is a module that speak to another city. But then India is also possibly thinking about selling each city to corporations. That's coming up. So we can go back. Yeah. Okay. So
Sherry, if I could jump in, it's the fact that you're using India as an example, and we're going to be talking about China. It's not a coincidence that the two places we're talking about that are leading the forefront in smart cities are also authoritarian or increasingly authoritarian regimes in the case of India. So there's a lot to unpack from what you just talked about. There's the human rights aspect, because these technologies are being used to control the population. If you think even just of the film we watched, the first 4 minutes of Frame, there's social engineering going on in there where the person who gives up his seat is rewarded. So there's some repercussions in terms of social engineering and human rights. And then there's also, like you touched on it already, the for-profit nature and the entrenching of these power relationships. I really question whether smart cities are a social investment or corporate welfare. I think of the Reaganomics and Margaret Thatcher in the UK and how they privatized industries. And so infrastructure that was built to be a public investment and a public good was actually just a transference of wealth from the public sector and citizenry to individual autocrats, not dissimilar to what we saw happen to the Russian infrastructures and national resources in the post-Yeltsin, early Putin years.
Thank you, Tom. And yes, you're exactly right. And I believe those were called community cohesion points that the person earned when they gave up their seat during the film. So quite interesting in that social aspect. Sherry, are we back to you?
Please hand it to Amanda.
Okay, thank you. Amanda, you're up.
Sure. So I just wanted to kind of reframe or lend an additional kind of perspective on some of this in context of sustainability and resilience, which as we are all sheltering in place, or most of us are these days, kind of lends into this theme very well. And so just to kind of level set on what we might mean by sustainability, I know that Sherry had mentioned some of the environmental aspects earlier. There's a definition that of sustainable development that's pretty widely accepted that I personally also like, which is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And why this is important in context of cities is that, as most of you know, there's growing trends and shifts in the population, a move towards urban areas. By 2050, about 2/3 of the world's population is predicted to live in urban areas, and many of these urban areas are coastal. I think about 90% are coastal areas, and even if they're not coastal, a lot of the other cities throughout the world are in areas that are at risk of different geologic, climate, social unrest type of events. And so creating this kind of sustainability and resiliency has been incredibly important. The UN had set sustainable development goals a number of years ago. I think they've renamed them the global goals since, just to be a little bit more friendly. I'll just drop into the chat. There's a goal around creating sustainable cities and communities. And I think that really how my view has been on approaching this, smart cities have a role to play whenever we're talking about infusing technology within cities. And really what it gets to from my perspective is this confluence of not only looking at the environmental, but really looking at the triple bottom line whenever we talk about cities and how we're implementing technology. So looking at both the economic and financial impacts, looking at equity and social impacts, and looking at environmental impacts. And so those three things kind of encapsulated are really what I talk about whenever I talk about sustainability, not just the environmental part. And this confluence between the technology, companies, private industry, government, nonprofits, and kind of co-creating this new model of smart cities and sustainable cities together.
Thank you, Amanda. And I think you've introduced a whole other layer to this conversation, which is exactly why we have you on this panel. And, you know, increasing interest from, I would say we have a number of educators attending this session, increasing interest from the education sector to bridge sectors, right? We talk about how we're working with workforce, or how even smaller sectors of education can integrate and work together. You know, I work at the Department of Higher Education. How are we more integrated in, you know, work-based learning experiences and therefore integrated into the workforce? So I think for educators, this message resonates as well. Okay, and speaking of education, we are on to answering this next question, which is, what role does education play? You know a little bit more about smart cities, some of the pros and cons perhaps, some definitions, thanks to Sherry, and what some of the trends are globally. So let's get into this conversation. Tom, I think you're up.
Yeah, and I think that was a perfect segue, because I do think that higher education has a multiple faceted role. So what you're talking about in terms of integration of sectors and integrating higher ed into those industry sectors, that's certainly a growing trend within higher ed. But I don't want to lose track of the traditional role of higher ed as well, that higher ed also exists independent and outside of the sectors. And there's a lot of value in that role as well. Higher ed's job is to develop and be part of the development of not just the technologies, but also the workforce, the people who are going to be administering those technologies, but also, and we're gonna, I know we're gonna keep coming back to this, higher ed's role is also to educate the citizenry who are going to be using the smart city technologies, as well as those citizenry who are going to become policymakers and politicians who are going to be making the decisions on implementation and choice of smart technologies.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
Yep, and that's exactly right. And I know from a number of faculty members that are probably attending this session, you would agree with Tom's assertion there.
And so this slide kind of was breaking down some of those roles of higher ed into specific fields. So of course, we're going to need the scientific research, the technology, the development of infrastructure, and utmost importance probably is cybersecurity and the role of higher ed working with industry to ensure cybersecurity for the new infrastructures. And I'm going to come back to that later in our presentation. But this is really, it's all public policy, right? You know, it's asking those questions. Is this going to be a national infrastructure that's going to be for the public good? Or as I said earlier, is it just going to be privatized and be a transfer of wealth? And Sherry mentioned this as well, is about social stratification. Is this going to narrow it, or is it going to accidentally widen the gaps in social stratification? Meaning, are there going to be equal access? In this COVID-19 reality, what we've seen nationally is a reemergence of social stratification. The school districts that have access to technology and have the ability to disseminate handheld devices, they hit the ground running, and other districts did not. So these kind of questions have to be asked, and they're uncomfortable. And so it's obvious that people in political positions might be uncomfortable either asking them themselves or being asked. So that's why higher ed serves as that kind of like public green to promote ethical discussions. What is the environmental impact, like Amanda said? What about the historic impact? What is going to be removed in order to build space for this infrastructure and technology? Are we going to be including the arts? Should there be a percentage of expenditure tied to the development of arts? The legal issues, police policies, constitutional issues. And this is a particular concern of mine. Can we ahead of time talk about what we're going to do? What is the goal of the budgetary aspect of smart cities? Is the goal to save money? I mean, because we know politicians want to talk about that. Or is it going to be an opportunity to reinvest money into other things to improve that social stratification and narrow that gap, as we talked about? All of these are cost-benefit analyses, some of them specifically economic and other social cost-benefit analysis, like the gap between, or the tension between safety and individual rights. So these are just some of the things I think we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. This is more of like an overview, and I think now we're going to go into a little bit more detail. So I mentioned cybersecurity is of the utmost importance. In I think it was November of 2019, CNN reported that the PROC, the People's Republic of China, they can take over. Let me say that again. The People's Republic of China can take over and stop the Filipino national energy grid at any point. That the problem with smart technologies is, yes, it's convenient that it causes and fosters interconnectivity, but that's a liability. That when you have hostile states or non-state actors like Anonymous, for example, you need to know ahead of time and plan ahead of time for those factors. The Ohio State energy grid is at risk as well. The United States uses transformers that are only manufactured in one country in the world, and you guessed it, it's the PROC. So when we see the surveillance cities that China is developing, particularly in Xinjiang, in the western part of China where the Uyghurs live, and that's the same place that we're going to for our technology, it's kind of scary. Data loss, privacy issues, who owns the data, ransomware, and then Amanda already mentioned weather and natural disasters. And I think, Kalia, if you want to jump in and talk about maybe that self-sovereign identity and those aspects.
Well, I mean, just building on what you were just saying about the situation in Xinjiang, this week or last week, I guess, Frontline released a documentary specifically about that area of China. So if you want to go and you don't need an artist's interpretation to understand a creepy smart city situation there. And I mean, I think this this brings up a whole set of issues. The community and the work that I've been doing is focused on how individuals can be at the center of their own digital representation and getting out of having identifiers assigned to us by outside entities and sort of anchoring in a digital wallet or agent that individuals control. And then people can collect different attributes and assertions about key things about themselves. You know, a simple example is like a birth certificate. So I happen to be born in the province of British Columbia. They're the authoritative source of my birth date. And so the question is, how could I get a digital representation of that assertion from that province and be able to use it other places and not have it phone home to the issuer, right? So there's always this issue of like, is the data true? And in the sort of conventional way, the way we think about it in paper, in systems is one is like we look at the paper and we might even call up the issuer once we're looking at the paper to verify it's true. And can we do this in a digital way that just the signature, the digital signatures of the issuers allow us to do that? What our technology hasn't really thought about or addressed is some of the things that you saw in the video is like, how are people being surveilled as they move around a city, and how are these systems capturing and using biometrics and sort of being like facial biometrics. So another thing we often think about biometrics, it says my connection is unstable. Hopefully you can hear me. People sort of freak out about biometrics, but we've had biometrics on our identity documents for a really long time. They're called photographs. And in fact, they're being used in all these systems. And so the question is, how are we protecting people from these systems? Illinois has a set of really interesting biometrics laws restricting the use of biometrics. It's going to be really, really critical for sort of cross-disciplinary understanding of both how do the technical systems work, how could they work in the future, what are the legal protections now, and what are the legal protections we have in the future. And it's been a real struggle within the communities I work in to understand the laws that apply to digital identity and understand the technologies. And there is very, very, very few people with cross-disciplinary understanding to get to a good place in the future. So I think I definitely see not higher education and sort of the research capacity that it has having a lot of potential to address these issues, but it has to be done in a sort of in a sort of almost forced cross-disciplinary way, because I do not want to read another law brief by a lawyer who doesn't understand how these technologies work. And I'm tired of listening to technologists invent an idea about how they think the law works. And we need a way through it. And you know, higher education sort of already does this. It needs to get better at it.
Sounds like a call to action, Kalia. Thank you for that. Yeah. Great. So I think, Amanda, you and I are taking this slide, and I wanted to start by saying, you know, scientific research and public policy. I think, Tom, you had mentioned this too, you know, the interest of the public good. And Sherry had also actually in her introduction started to talk a little bit about, you know, these hierarchies that exist, and who is disseminating the research, or who is conducting the research. And it's fascinating from where I sit in, you know, in state government or local government here, to find this proliferation and this want and this desire for data. And I'll talk about it from a higher education perspective more specifically. You know, we do administer surveys to the institutions. We do collect a variety of data from the institutions on students. And we also work in open education, right? And so a lot of the open advocates have been advocating, no surprise, for open data in that sense, which government does and does not do, I guess, depending on your perspective, not to stir any more pots. But we have been hearing these notions from institutions and from other outside researchers saying, you know, the data that's being collected on the students, right? The surveillance data from some of these online platforms, these online homework platforms, for example, is being used to sell the institutions further, you know, enhancements for in the name of student success. And so to me, it's a little bit of a disturbing concept, the proprietary interest in student data, but it is something that we're navigating, and we're seeing institutions navigate at this time. So from the Department of Higher Education's perspective, we are integrating those sectors, as was mentioned before, and we're looking at sharing data with other state agencies, because that often is not done, but we're also looking at what are the ramifications at the institutional level. Amanda, I think you had some other points on public policy specifically.
Yeah, and I can kind of segue from what you just said as well, because I think in my experience, you know, in terms of research, there's many different types of institutions, from academic to, you know, private industry to like public, you know, and so there's a lot of silos, and there's a lot of research happening around different topics, but the people doing the research also aren't always the best people to carry the message or to package it in a way that resonates with policymakers or businesses. And so I think Kalia really hit it on the head of something that I'm passionate about, that I spoke to earlier, about this kind of cross-disciplinary understanding and kind of understanding how to make things useful across industries and sectors. And I've consulted like with some other nonprofits even, on great research that they've done that, you know, that they don't know how to then take forward and do something with, right, and implement, but they have great research skills. And so the nonprofit that I work for is, that works with public policymakers on advocacy and research and kind of changing different aspects in the Bay Area. And so I think that like having people who can speak that language, and then even just personally, you know, I mentioned that I have an MBA. I'm actually wrapping up adding an MPA to that, because I found it just personally really valuable to have that kind of dual angle. And policymakers are really looking for people who can help them make good decisions, because they have a lot on their plate, and oftentimes they get very lengthy materials to read over, right? And may not have the time or the ability to digest it. Not just policymakers, but people who serves on, you know, the board of transportation agencies or other types of agencies that may not have the background to understand some of the ramifications of the policies. So people who are able to translate that for them are so important.
That's right, Amanda. I can attest to that as well. So I do want to do a quick check real quick, because I think we are making our way through our slides just a little bit slower than we had planned, but we do have a couple more topics to cover, and then we do want to turn it over to Q&A. So Tom and Sherry, I'm going to turn it back to you all, knowing that we wrap up at 3:50, and that we'd like to maybe share about 5 minutes for Q&A at the minimum. So it's about 3:41 right now.
I can go through this pretty quickly. I think I've already alluded to it about the importance of higher ed to be that gut check. This other thought I had about morality and ethics, I was also just thinking about the unique nature of higher ed, that while there are scientists in higher ed and out, there are public policy people in higher ed and out, lawyers in and out, and so forth. It just seems to me that one of the things that we sometimes lose sight of is that our ethical philosophers and moral theologians really are only in higher ed outside of the clergy. So it's a unique role that higher ed fills. So I'm going to turn it over to Sherry.
Thanks, Tom. So quickly adding on to what Tom just said, I believe one way to counter some of the scary scenarios that we were looking at is it's going to rest on participatory citizenship, which is the idea that the citizen will participate in the ethics, creating policy, design, okay, and playful thinking. So in play studies, the word play means experimentation. So if the citizens are allowed to participate in the design of cities or have commentary about the city, that will level the playing field, if you will. So it's not just the top down, but it will be ground up. And I gave a couple of examples, which is that there might be interactive displays where people can actually manipulate and show the governor, show someone how they think the city planning should go as a recommendation, right? Also self-driving cars that is programmed to take people on specific learning quest as a research a specific part of the city or understand the history of something. And also I just put it in there that there are already robots interviewing citizens, at least in China, that's what they're doing.
And so the role of higher ed is to help create that active citizen, that participatory citizen, and to make sure that in order for a citizen to be participatory, they have to know what their rights are. And police agencies all across the country have citizen boards. And those citizen boards have to be educated not just on the community issues and the law, but increasingly, like Amanda and Kalia said, they have to be educated on technology issues. How can those citizen boards be making recommendations to the police departments if they don't understand the repercussions of some of these choices in terms of technology? There are real issues in terms of the Fourth Amendment. Search and seizure. What the argument has been, and this has been litigated, is the difference between active tracking and passive tracking. But not everybody understands that. And interrelated to something else that Kalia said is there has to be an opt-out option. That why is it that people who are not being told that they're being tracked are being, their data is being used without them knowing about it and without them being given the opt-out rights? The state of California just passed major legislation that went into effect in January to protect some of those data rights. There's also issues of privacy that are interrelated to the tracking. And then there's a due process, almost picture Minority Report, right? Like how are we making sure that we're protecting the due process rights of people at the same time as we're making choices to use technology to make smart cities and life more efficient. Going back to China, with the COVID-19 crisis, China was able to shut down the spread of the virus pretty quickly because there's no due process and because there's tracking of its citizenry. The fever stations that were put up everywhere. You don't have the option of checking out. That there's this, not just this industry of AI surveillance that our own corporations, as Sherry Jones has educated me about, Facebook and Google and Microsoft, helping China to turn their government into a police state. But at the same time, it's building up cottage industries of how to get around those technologies. But if you have cottage industries of technologies to avoid facial recognition, you're once again increasing social stratification, because it means the people with money can opt out with technology, and the lower class or working class people their rights are being abridged. So Sherry, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about that predictive policing in line with surveillance states.
Just a quick note, predictive policing, it refers to a class of software where you are predicting future crimes. Who's going to commit crime based on data? It started in Chicago, city of Denver has it, many major cities has it, and that obviously is a legal problem because now we're seeing some problem with racial and class profiling because the police will circle around particular classes of low income folks to capture criminals.
And there was a question that came up in the chat. It was a really great question. To what extent college campuses, to what extent are college campuses mini smart cities? And I could see some of the parallels with some of the predictive analytics and some of the learning platforms that we use in higher ed and some of the controversies in that vein as well. Now I know we're getting close to time here. I'm told that we do not have another session after this, but I do want to make sure that we make enough time for the Q&A. So, you know, I think that I'll leave it up to our panelists to kind of share any sort of closing thoughts. And we want to respect other folks' time as well. If you have something else planned and you wanted to join this. So any closing thoughts for the panelists before we open it up to the floor for Q&A?
Spencer, you can probably move on to the conclusion slide. We can skip this and go on to the conclusion slide if you like. Yes.
Thanks, Sherry. So, you know, some of the notes that I have here, and I would warmly welcome any chat questions or commentary, or if you want to, I don't know if you can flick your microphone on, maybe you can't. So go ahead and throw any comments in and any chat questions in the chat. But I think that in terms of the role of education, specifically higher education, there is a responsibility role that was outlined by a number of the speakers here, whether it be through the education of the resident of a city or a smart city or a non-smart city. What is the opposite of a smart city? Sherry, you didn't define that for us. A regular old city. And that's one that jumps out to me. But I think one of the most interesting topics that really was kind of pervasive throughout all four of the panelists is this human rights question, right? And there's a human rights element to each and every one of the perspectives that was shared. And so I think to the extent that education or higher education can and is able to continue to have these conversations around the human rights aspects of all participation of the citizenry, you know, this is something that's really interesting to me personally. I think Jay George has a commentary, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it out because you had another question as well. Facial recognition happening on college campuses now. It's concerning and hopeful at some point. It's concerning and hopeful at the same point. How do you export the moral philosophy of equitable and good smart cities when it may be rotten from the start? Great question. Oh, and that was a question from Brandon, actually. So, you know, if any of the panelists want to tackle those questions or any of our wrap-up questions here, I'll leave the floor open.
I would just make the observation that to that point, you look at the origins of Facebook, which was a violation of people's rights to their images when it was created originally.
And I'll add too that California is kind of taking the lead on facial recognition software. They're already banning it. So when we say rotten to the core or rotten from the beginning, I think it's a pessimistic view that we can't use governance, co-governance, to stop certain policies from happening, especially in higher ed. It shouldn't be happening.
You know, there's a question here for something that we're, and it's one of the wrap-up questions at the bottom, potential systems for change and acceleration of adopting technologies due to the new paradigm created by coronavirus, which is something that we didn't even really get to during this conversation, but would be really fascinating for anybody to weigh in on. Let me check the chat here.
Sure, I can comment. There's a lot of activity going on amongst the communities. One that is really focused on how people can own and control their own data. It's mydata.org. And they've been connecting app developers and having a weekly call for anybody interested in learning more about how to support COVID tracking systems that are ethical and consent-based and in alignment with strong values. And there's also work going on around potentially, if it ever, depending on how things work out, immunity certificates. So if people have a serological test, and sort of how to issue those certificates in ways that center people and don't, for example, make a giant list of everybody who's tested for that. And that would be a bad way to design that system. But if I have some sort of way to prove to an employer or a grocery store or whatever, like it, you know, there's a lot of questions about how these would get used, but I think if we're looking at potentially 2 years before there's a vaccine, we're going to have to figure out some other ways to support like slightly larger gatherings of people than everybody being stuck at home.
And that tension that I talked about before between safety and individual rights, there's also a parallel tension between individual rights and the common good. So in your example, you know, if somebody tests positive, you can make the argument they do not have the right to that privacy, that it's in the public good that certain people know who's been tested positive, and what, and as always, it's always, where is that line, right?
And then just one more thing to add, in terms of the coronavirus, like impact on like technology adoption. I mean, obviously we see it at, you know, the private and kind of individual level. I sit smack dab in the middle of Silicon Valley, literally here, where I'm at right now. And I know that a lot of the tech companies that I work with here have been really working very closely with governments during this time on how to govern in light of the restrictions that we have. And so where normally it would be a very slow kind of bureaucracy and process to like make some of these changes, they're being forced to adapt very rapidly to being comfortable with technology and governance in a virtual world. So just wanted to add that as commentary as well.
A great point. And as a matter of fact, when you're talking about government and data, I think about data governance and just this trend that I've seen. And we just, in fact, appointed a director of data governance who actually worked at our organization before, but there's a demand for it, certainly. And all the number of projects that we've been involved with, you know, you can't leave it on one person, but I will say that it's interesting to see that developing in our organization as well. I know we're over time, but I did see a couple other questions. And so let me see, where did that go? Wow, you leave the chat alone for a moment and it really just takes off on its own.
Kalia's been adding a lot of awesome tidbits.
That's great. Thank you, Kalia. You know, I'll leave it up to you all to pull any other threads. But I think we are near the end of our time, and we want to thank you all. And perhaps those who are able, welcome to stick around and continue to chat. Brandon, if that's okay.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. I'll stick around. This is the end of my day as well, and I'm happy to facilitate broader discussion if people wanna stay.
That's great. And thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you so much to the panelists who brought such great perspectives. Honored to work with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I do feel like we maybe should bring a sense of hope to this conversation. So I don't know where that goes, but I know it was a great conversation, but I feel like there was a call to action from a number of you specifically, but yeah, that's where I'm sitting, I guess.
You know, I'll mention something that's been kicking around is I do know that we're sharing, on the 4 or 5 of us, we're sharing a lot of concerns, but
uh-oh, Tom, we lost you on your bandwidth. Right when he was about to give us the positive.
I'll jump in if when Tom comes back. I'm not sure. I'll jump in regarding that particular question, which is about the, and Kalia already answered it wonderfully, that what are we supposed to do with technical specialists who are designing software, designing solutions that have inherent ethical problems in them, right? So from an education, I can only speak from an education side because I'm in education. I'm currently teaching ethics courses to computer science majors. And for years, what I've been doing is an experimentation because I refuse to believe that I can't teach tech to philosophy students and I can't teach philosophy to technology students. Okay, so I try to do this cross-interdisciplinary stuff. So I used to ask philosophy students to create chatbots with me. So I would teach them how to code artificial intelligence chatbots, and then we would release them on Facebook and Twitter and see what the reaction was, how people get confused by the chatbots as a way to demonstrate that. And same thing with ethics. I would explain the way I would design my courses is actually bring those examples that all of us brought on this panel on what are we supposed to do? Here's the philosophical theory. How are we supposed to deal with this current problem using this philosophical theory? So I agree, Kalia, we really do need that cross interdisciplinary study of all of these because we can't solve a problem from one set of discipline.
Great point, Sherry. I think you and I talked a little bit about that too, because I've talked to some faculty who are doing some fascinating things. They're humanities faculty doing some programming type things that you kind of along the same lines of some stuff that you mentioned too. So Tom's back. You're about to hit a home run with giving us some hope at the end.
Yeah.
And then we lost you. So what kind of sign is that?
I'm using ancient Roman imperial technology, apparently.
I don't know if you had anything else to add, Tom, Amanda,
Kalia.
Kalia.
Anything you said, so you have to tell us.
Oh, you couldn't hear me at all?
No.
Oh, I don't know where I got cut off. I'm sorry. I was saying that you know, I operate from a perspective of being excited about the opportunities of smart cities and these new technologies. It's just that I want the choices to be made reflectively and not impulsively. And the anecdote I was sharing about ancient Rome was that Caesar used to, while he was going through his parades, he had a second charioteer with him whose job was to stand behind him and just whisper, remember thou art mortal. So it's okay to have the excitement of the parade and the new toys. You just got to remember that we're mortal.
That's a great anecdote, Tom.
Waiting for.
I want to take your class now. I want to take. Do you and Sherry tag team a class? That would be great.
We have actually.
Have you? That would be awesome.
Together.
I was going to say, I love that anecdote. And on that, I actually have to jump to another meeting. But thank you for everyone who spoke with me and everyone who attended. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda.
Bye.
I also have to jump at that hour. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kalia. And thanks to everybody else who was able to attend. We appreciate it. Hopefully the conversation continues. I don't know in what venue, but I'm sure there will be more to come.
Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you. Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you all very much for coming. Yeah, I take it to Twitter. That's my suggestion. You'll get a lot of. I've been live tweeting your session. I've been doing that with all of them that I've moderated. So check out the hashtag. You can correct my incorrect interpretations of what you've said or retweet. Hopefully the ones that are right. So thank you and yeah, have a great rest of your day. Stay safe and healthy, and hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.